Welcome. Today I want to talk about what the title is Socially Engaged Stewardship. And I think it comes out of, it actually comes from the topic of engaged Buddhism and the conversation that we are having amongst the committee that is hosting what we call the Sangha gathering on race and racism and racial injustice. And so there's a way in which we're trying to sort of understand how in the Hollow Bones Zen lineage tradition, how to make sense of this particular need to be open to what's arising in the field, and what is clearly arising in, at least in America, but I believe all over the world, is this sense of racism, racial injustice, finding justice around race in America, which is a strong pull. And how do we, as practitioners of Buddhist principles, find a way of participating or making sense within a Buddhist practice? And so the first connection is engaged Buddhism. And so I want to start by just even defining that particular term, and didn't go very far in this stage. Wikipedia seems to be a place to start, but I really actually appreciated what I found in Wikipedia. Engaged Buddhism refers to Buddhists who are seeking ways to apply the insights from meditation practice and Dharma teachings to situations of social, political, environmental, and economic suffering and injustice. Apply the insights of meditation practice and Dharma teachings to social, political, environmental, and economic suffering and injustice. Engaged Buddhism. There's some roots in the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. There is some roots in the work of Bernie Glassman, who, for any of those who know his work in the 90s and 80s in New York with his bakery. And there's roots that go far beyond that. Interestingly, there's a Zen and Buddhism start to sort of bump up against each other, because often we've inherited a tradition in Zen of what is a monastery tradition. So the rituals that we practice are ones that were constructed through various generations from going off in the monastery to sit. And so there's what attracts many people to Hollow Bones and Zen in particular is that monastery practice of Zazen. And so do we find Buddhism engaged when we sit in the monastery in settling and finding clarity? And for many, the idea of engaged Buddhism is, well, how do I bring my practice into my daily life, into how I live my life, and to make sense of it in that way? So we're trying to make room for both, which we like to say at Hollow Bones is to transcend and include. So we are not a monastery practice, even though for many we began with Hollow Bones Zen by going to a retreat or a sesshin. That was our first introduction. Well, many of the introduction may have been through watching something on a YouTube or discovering it through a book. But the practice itself is about, the rituals are monastic fundamentally. And yet, once we find our way into Hollow Bones, we quickly bump into what are called the precepts. And the precepts is what you take when you do Jukai. And there's lots in our sutra books. So if you are not familiar with the precepts, please look in the sutra book. And interestingly, the precepts are, how we try to bring this teachings into our daily life. How do we live the life of engagement in many ways? And so there are historically 10 precepts. Well, some would say there's 16 precepts. There's many numbers of precepts, but interestingly, in Hollow Bones, we've added one precept, which seems to be, I have not found it anywhere else, which ends up being our 10th precept, which is Steward the Earth. And so I just want to read Steward the Earth because I think I'm going to connect these dots for us in many ways. Steward the Earth. I hold sacred this planet Earth. I seek to understand nature's interconnections and celebrate my own interdependency. I work toward achieving a lifestyle that gives more back to this earth than I take away from it. I hold sacred this planet Earth. Steward the Earth. So in the precepts, you know, we move very much from the interpersonal, affirm life, act generously, be loving, celebrate others, embody compassion, to bringing the whole, the planet, some say Gaia, and steward the earth, hold sacred this planet. And of course, that includes all life on the planet. And I think to some extent the intention of it was to move beyond the interpersonal human beings into sentient, all sentient and insentient beings. So you can see how in Buddhism, all of life has been in the tradition for thousands of years. It is not simply how we interact with one another. But still, in this language, I hold sacred this planet Earth. I seek to understand nature's interconnections and celebrate my own interdependency. You could say there's an emphasis moving beyond human, and at the same time, there is the interconnections include us, include the people. And of course, referring back to my definition of engaged Buddhism, we said the Dharma teachings of social, political, environmental, and economic suffering. So that is a type of engaged Buddhism. Another way that Hollow Bones Zen and Mondo Zen teachings engage this topic is through the 5 training elements. And our first training element is sacred stewardship. So you see this line here, steward the earth, practice sacred stewardship. That's part of our regular practice. So the 5 training elements are, you know, of course, they have Zazen, meditation, emotional koans, which you learn through doing, you know, Mondo Zen koan work. Conscious embodiment, that's why Bodhi just gave us his teachings and the practice of showing up. There's this philosophical cognitive reindoctrination, which is this understanding, this studying, this is what Dharma talks are oriented toward, that cognitive understanding what we're doing, but we also have sacred stewardship. So I want to read this particular one too. This is again the Sutra book. What is sacred stewardship? What does this stewardship include? How am I as an individual fulfilling my commitment to stewardship? And am I acting with integrity in this chosen responsibility? How do the patterns of my consumption affect the earth and the environment I live within? On what do I spend my energy and money? How does stewardship relate to community? Does a good steward have an organic standard? That last one makes me smile because I hear Junpo's Joker energy in that. But interestingly, beyond the Steward the Earth precept, you really hear in this training practice, how do the patterns of my consumption affect the earth and environment I live within? How am I as an individual fulfilling my commitment to stewardship? And am I acting with integrity? How does stewardship relate to community? So once again, now we see there's a much more an engagement in relationships. So engaged Buddhism, in a way, in Hollow Bones, is under the rubric and under the guise of sacred stewardship. They may perhaps be one and the same. And so that actually is probably the big idea of this talk, is that is in sacred stewardship, we are including our engagement with a topic as challenged for many of us as race and racial injustice. Moving up one level, when we look at Zen and how does Zen engage in race and racial justice, we may bring it all the way back to Four Awakened Vows. Okay, because in the first awakened vow, we just said it earlier, however innumerable all beings are, I vow to serve and liberate them all. So we include everyone, right? There is no distinction between race, socioeconomic status, accessibility. Everyone is in the vow of the Mahayana. Right. Now, interestingly, that is one of the distinctions of Mahayana Buddhism as opposed to Theravada, is this idea that personal liberation is not the goal. Personal liberation without liberation of all beings is not quite liberation, or is still incomplete, I guess would be a more accurate way of saying it. And so, again, we engage Buddhism is included in the basic vows of the Mahayana. So from here, we start to get a little bit more into how do we get then more specific? How do we not lose the orientation of the work that is ahead of us as a culture? And so that then it becomes this idea of learning, of dealing with the word privilege. Okay, and so I want to start with, to me, the word privilege, I want to use as a verb at the moment, and in the idea of what am I privileging by my focus and orientation? So, for example, if I live in a monastery and I meditate a lot, I'm privileging my work, and I'm privileging the Dharma teaching of the monastery. Okay, that's just what the orientation is. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the rest of the work. It just means I'm privileging this particular work. Okay, and we all privilege, some people privilege what they eat. Some people privilege what they exercise. Some people privilege their work. Some people privilege their family. Okay, so privilege can be a volitional and often becomes some more of a habit. But privilege has another meaning when it comes to race, and that is privileged, right? Which is the idea that somehow we, through who we were born at any given moment in time, have a privilege that comes with being born into whatever race and socioeconomic status that we accidentally were born into. Okay, because most of us didn't choose these particular bodies. If you like to believe the Tibetan perspective, these stories that we are living chose us. We got exactly the right. We were privileged to show up in who we are exactly this way. And so anyway, and this idea is that we have privilege. There is privilege. So when we start to talk about race, right, we start to talk about a term like whiteness, right? Because that is a big term that is going to show up quite a bit. We recognizing that whiteness is not actually the color of your skin. It is the term that is being used right now for the cultural meme that privileges a certain perspective that has its origins in European culture coming to America and spreading throughout the world. And for better or for worse, setting up a situation where that white Eurocentric culture privileges certain perspectives, certain ways of being, and other cultures which are Black, indigenous, persons of colors are somehow by default not privileged. That's pretty much what I hear in the word privilege and whiteness. So now I'm going to take it back and just connect this up to this idea of Buddhism. And so I'm going to read a passage, and this passage is coming from Radical Dharma by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. It's slightly adapted for this teachings. Right. Just as the ego mind is a construct that constantly reinforces itself, so does the construct of whiteness. Just as the ego mind is a construct that constantly reinforces itself, building structures and systems of control and developing attitudes and views that maintain its primacy and sense of solidity, so does this construct of whiteness. Whiteness is a social ego as void of inherent identity as the personal ego. Just as the ego mind is a construct that constantly reinforces itself, so does the construct of whiteness, which is a social ego as void and inherent of identity as the personal ego. So on one level, it's easy with Buddhism, just be in the monastery and meditate. And through that process of the first awakened vow, we're handling it. We're dealing with it, right? Because it's all an illusion. It's all a delusion. When we do our work, we can transcend ego. We can transcend race. But it's not so easy. Because, and I'm another passage, just as the ego mind cannot be used to work its way out of its own construct, so too can the mind of whiteness. So too can the mind of whiteness not be used to see through the veil of its own construct. I'll read that again. Just as the mind cannot be used to work its way out of its own construct, so too can the mind of whiteness not be used to see through the veil of its own construct. What I hear about that is it's somehow, if we just rely on it to happen all by itself through our meditation, then we're not actually really seeing what needs to be seen. We have to see it. We have to know what it is in order to be able to transcend and include. And that means we need to allow it to be present, and allow it to be part of who we are and what is happening in this moment in our time. So to wrap this, to move it really, to make sense, to put this together, Engaged Buddhism is applying the insights from meditation and Dharma teachings to situations of social, political, environmental, and economic suffering. Right. In Hollow Bones, Engaged Buddhism is engaged stewardship, socially engaged stewardship. So the community is, a percentage of Hollow Bones community is finding their way toward engaging the subject of race and racism, this social construct, in order to do our work to serve and liberate us all. And that is done through our individual work, and it is also done to see that concept, that structure, that artificial structure of whiteness as just as much a delusion. In order to see that, we have to actually allow it to be present and arise within our practice. And that is going to take a little bit of understanding what that is. That is a little bit of really listening and feeling the pain, of really allowing ourselves to recognize that we may not think of ourselves as whiteness. I may not think of myself as whiteness, but I was born into this. And that's something that I need to look at and understand. and make sense of and sit on my cushion and transcend with the Sangha so that all beings can awaken to find their way. Thank you.